back after the break. So we have 2 more talks for the afternoon session if you're in California. Otherwise, it's a different type of session in other parts of the world. They're going to be sort of one on the intersection of blockchains and law, and another one with economics. And first talk will be given by Primavera. So please go ahead. The virtual stage is yours. And thank you for giving me a talk.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is more of like a legal and governance talk. And so the talk is about like what is the interplay, the interconnection between regulation and governance, and between the rule of law and the rule of code. And so yeah, my research is mostly about trying to understand like the extent to which blockchain technology can be used both as a regulatory technology, so as a way of incorporating some technological guarantees in order to achieve some regulatory compliance, but at the same time, like what are the tools that we can leverage in order to also ensure the proper governance of this technology. So just to, in very short overview, basically like those characteristics of blockchain technology that distinguish itself from traditional software platforms, so decentralization, the global and transnational nature of the network, the resiliency, the non-coercion, which is particularly important in this for the purpose of this talk, in the sense that as opposed to traditional software platforms where the platform operator can just by unilaterally modify the code and the infrastructure of the platform, and that modification will automatically be imposed and therefore adopted by all the users of the platform. In the case of a blockchain-based network, every change in the protocol actually have to be accepted, so there is no possible coercion. And then, of course, tamper resistancy, there's transparency in order to enable for the verification, the non-repudiability, and at least in the context of permissionless blockchain, the pseudonymity. And then finally, in the context of blockchains that enable the creation of smart contract and the guarantee of execution. And so those characteristics are what leads to qualify blockchain-based network as being like, on the one hand, trustless in the sense that we no longer need to trust as centralized operators, and instead of being based on a trusted system, then it becomes more of a proof system, and therefore it becomes possible to disintermediate. And on the other hand, which is connected to the disintermediation aspect, is the autonomy that is inherent in those systems, meaning that on the one hand, we can automate operation, but at the same time, those operations become unstoppable in the sense that no one can unilaterally change, modify, or even stop the executions of those software. And so this raises some interesting questions, at least concerning this, the complementarity or the discrepancy between the rule of code, which is incorporated within a blockchain-based systems, and the rule of law, which is defined by the regulatory system. And so, as a short overview about the rule of law, so the principle is essentially that no one stands above the law, that everyone is equal under the law, and the law should apply equally to everyone. Law should also be transparent, clear, precise, and accessible to everyone, and then everyone should have timely access to legal remedy and justice mechanism. And this, of course, comes with the necessity of having an independent judiciary in order to ensure that that the political power does not actually control the judiciary process. And this stands in contrast with the rule by law, where the idea is that some actors, so the sovereigns, stand above the law, and therefore they can actually proceed through the instrumentalization of law as a tool of political power. And so if we look at the internet, at least in the early days, then there was this general belief, at least, or narrative, that the internet is neither governed by the rule of law and is also not governed by the rule by law, but it is this kind of independent space that that cannot be regulated because government do not have the capacity, or at least the right, to exerce this sovereignty over this decentralized network. But then, of course, as time passes and as we see the emergence of the centralized platforms, which somehow process a lot of the traffic on the internet, then we can see how slowly this decentralization and therefore the narrative that came with the decentralization do no longer apply. And so when we look at the internet today, at least like in the current state of affairs with like those large online operators, we can say that the internet is currently regulated by the rule by code, meaning that those online operators can actually instrumentalize the code of the platform, the architecture, as a tool of political power and to serve their own economic or commercial interests. And so we speak about digital federalism and functional sovereignty, but basically the idea is that those platforms are above the code, above the law that is generated by the code, and they can unilaterally change it at any time. And so, and this can be to some extent contrasted with a blockchain-based infrastructure, which can be said to be governed by the rule of code, because again, in that case, no one is above the code. So because of like the polycentricity and the disintermediation and the decentralization inherent in those systems, no one can unilaterally modify the rules of the game. And so there is this kind of technical sovereignty, and even the people that designed and deployed applications on the blockchain do not actually have the power to change those rules. And so if we go back to the previous theorization of like code is law, introduced by Lawrence Lessig in the early days, we can see that there is actually a distinction between two different types of code is law. We have the more traditional Lex Informatica, which is essentially the rule by code, and then we have the Lex Cryptographica, which is the more blockchain-based system, which is governed by the rule of code. And this is important when we think about regulation, because it is actually quite easy to regulate a system that is ruled by code, because then it's suffices to identify who is the sovereign, who is the actual online operator that control this code, and then regulate those online operators in order to indirectly regulate the individuals. Whereas in the model of Lex Cryptographica, because we have lost those traditional centralized operators, then it is harder to regulate the system unless we can find some new intermediaries that could themselves be regulated. And so this leads us back to this, again, like the initial narrative of the internet, where Lawrence Lessig introduced the notion of unregulability to present the difficulty that exists in regulating such a decentralized and transnational network. And in the blockchain space, people like to refer to the system as being illegal, meaning that they exist outside, they create their own technological framework that exists outside of the regulatory framework, and therefore cannot be touched or affected by the law. And we can see already quite a few applications where we can see this discrepancy of like this conflict between the use of blockchain technology and the existing regulatory framework, whether it's about money laundering, whether it's about like deployment of decentralized marketplaces for the sale of illegal goods or services, whether it's about incorporating directly into the blockchain some illicit content, which could be like copyright infringement, which could be like incitation to violence or links to pedophilia, etc. And then, of course, also like the question with the right to be forgotten, whether a blockchain-based system can actually be compliant with those rules. And then one field in which this discrepancy between the rule of code and the rule of law is quite apparent is the context of property rights, where traditional property rights are defined by the law and therefore they can also be taken away by the law. And so if I illegitimately acquire a particular piece of property, then a judge can declare that I'm not the legitimate owner of this asset and therefore can seize it from me. Whereas when we move into the model of blockchain-based assets and cryptographic property, then those property are actually defined by the code and therefore they can only be taken away by the code. So if I legitimately acquire some Bitcoins, then regardless of what a judge might say, then no one can actually seize them from me unless the code specifically provide for that. And then similarly in the context of contracts, there is this interesting discrepancy in the sense that traditional legal contracts are defined by the law, by contract law, and they need to be enforced by a third party, by the judiciary, which will look at what is the actual intention of the parties in order to decide how to enforce the contract. Whereas in the case of smart contracts, they are defined by the code and they are automatically enforced by the underlying technology. And so the enforcement is not done by looking at what is the intention of the party, but only what is the actual wording of the code. And so we have had a very interesting example of this discrepancy with the incident of the DAO hack, where this decentralized investment fund managed to raise about like $150 million. And then at some point, the vulnerability was found in the code and was used in order to move about $50 million worth of Ether away from this smart contract. And so this created a very heated debate and discussion within the Ethereum community about what is the actual thing that we should look at? Shall we look at what is the intention of the parties that have entered into the smart contract? And of course, those parties did not intend to enter into a contract in which it was possible to take the money away, or whether we should actually just look at the specific wording of the code in which this action was legitimate because it was actually incorporated within the code of the smart contract. And so then the question was, shall we intervene in order to take the money back and give it back to the original holders? And if we need to look at the intention of the code, then the attacker that exploited this flow actually had stolen the money, and so it was actually legitimate to restore the balance. Whereas if we consider the wording of the code, then that the attacker actually did something legitimate, and then taking the money away from the attacker then will qualify as a theft. But then, of course, the question is kind of a moot question, because regardless, like even if this question had been taken to a judge, then regardless of what the judge would have said, because there is no centralized authority that can enforce the law, then the trustless character and the autonomous character of the DAO is such that it's really difficult to actually enforce this decision into the system. So what happened is that the community somehow had to come to a solution on its own. And because of the non-coercivity of the system, then it has led to a bifurcation, to a fork between one network that actually decided to modify the protocol in order to retrieve the funds, and one that refused to retrieve the protocol, which has become Ethereum Classic. So the interesting thing, if we actually compare it back to the rule of law, is that this actually can be regarded as a state of exception in which there has been a decision to depart from the protocol rules. And so in the same way as the rule of law can sometimes be displaced by, in the case of an emergency within a state of exception, then the rule of code as well can actually be displaced when there is a similar state of exception. But then the question is, who is the sovereign? So in the traditional rule of law system, then there is always a sovereign that takes the power. But in the case of a blockchain, it's not clear who that sovereign actually is. And this is because, of course, there are like all those different power dynamics that come into play. And even the decision of actually entering into a state of exception is something that needs to be done through distributed consensus. And this is interesting because it actually shows the importance of governance and social norm within the regulation and within the operation of a blockchain-based system. And we can see how different blockchain network might actually favor different values and social norm. And so we can see, for instance, like in the context of Bitcoin, which actually has a very strong flavor towards immutability and irreversibility, and like this notion of coded with law, and the protocol should never be modified in particular to change things retroactively, as opposed to, in that case, at least like the Ethereum community, which on that particular incident has decided that as long as there is community consensus that something can actually be modified, then it is okay. It is still compliant with the principle and the values of the blockchain community. And so what is interesting is that while on the traditional Lex Informatica or traditional internet platforms, then as the law start having struggled to regulate directly internet user, but can actually regulate the infrastructure, the architecture, that in order to then regulate users. In the case of a blockchain-based system, it's actually social norms, it's actually the governments that can affect the architecture of the system, and therefore indirectly affect the operation and the behavior of its users. And so, of course, these require to distinguish between the governance by the infrastructure, which is like what has been specifically and explicitly codified within the blockchain-based infrastructure, which is oftentimes formalized, but that is only about the enforcement, like it's about the rules that are codified and are automatically enforced by the technology, as opposed to governance of the infrastructure, which is oftentimes much less formal and quite invisible. But that's actually the important one, because that's the one that elaborates the rule that will then be codified within the infrastructure. But this is also the governance of the infrastructure that can actually declare a state of exception and that can affect and modify those rules in specific circumstances. And so who are those actors that can actually play a role into the governance of the infrastructure and by the infrastructure? So we have, of course, at the layer 0, we have like the developers, so the people that are proposing the possible changes to a protocol. And then we have like the network participants, so the miners and the validators that need to accept those changes by creating their clients. But then we also have other types of actors which somehow have a very strong influence into the decision making of which changes to adopt and which forks to follow. And those are like all the influencers, which are oftentimes people that have like the founder of projects, or the people that have very good technical knowledge, the people that are like very vocal on social media and so forth. And then we have like, of course, the mining pool, which aggregate like a lot of the mining power, but then also the supernodes, which are, for instance, like the blockchain explorer, the cryptocurrency exchanges, which somehow act as an aggregator between many users that rely on their services. And so even though technically they don't actually have that much power, from an economic and from a political perspective, they actually have a lot of power, because if they choose to follow one fork rather than the other, then all the users that are on that exchange will obviously follow the same network, the same fork, and then everyone that wants to interact with those users will also follow the same fork. So they do actually have a very, very strong power into influencing the Schelling point. And then, so there is of course the question of like those within like the blockchain governance rules. So all those actors play together within this polycentric system in order to come to a decision which needs to be consensual. And then, but there are like different types of rules that can influence those governance procedure, and some of them are endogenous, which are designed and imposed by the community itself. Some of them are exogenous, meaning that they come from the outside. And so in the case of endogenous rules, so we have, of course, like the on-chain governance rules, which are encoded directly into the blockchain protocol or within the code of a smart contract. But we also have like all those rules that the community has implemented in order to facilitate governance of things that cannot be codified directly into the blockchain. And so that's like the improvement proposal procedure, it's like the community social norm and so forth. But then in terms of exogenous rule, we also need to account for like specific rules that are technical rules that are imposed potentially by actors, like whether that's like the internet service providers, whether that's like the mining device manufacturer or so forth, which can codify specific rules that come from the outside and yet are affecting the operation of a blockchain-based network. But then we also have those external rules that are not directly part of the community, but yet are affecting the community member, and that can be like either between like contractual agreements between the different actors, but also the various laws and regulations that might affect the way in which a particular community will make a decision. And this is interesting to look at, especially given like those different decisions that have been taken on the one hand from the DAO attack, in which the Ethereum community has decided, at least in a large majority, to change a protocol in order to fix a problem that was considered to be worth of intervention. Whereas the parity bug, which actually was, so like money got frozen into a smart contract. And in that case, even though the fix was actually quite simple, like it was very clear how to resolve the problem. And it was much less controversial because it was not really about taking money away from someone. It was actually just about reviving a particular smart contract. Somehow the decision was not to intervene. And the question then was like, why has there been like a different decision? And again, it relates to the state of exception. And in the case of the DAO, there really was an emergency. There was a particular limited amount of time in which a decision could be taken in order for those funds to be retrievable, whereas in the parity case, there was as much time as necessary to make this decision. And also it was, whereas the DAO attack was like the first of a kind, it was the first time that this situation came about. And so it was an exceptional situation. The parity bug as the second case, to some extent, if a decision was made to intervene, then it could not just be justified as an exception, but it should have been justified as a process. And that means that it will require setting up a procedure, justifying and explaining and formalizing when is it that intervention can be done, who are the people in charge of deciding when this intervention should be done. And of course, these also come with potential responsibilities on the people deciding. And so all of a sudden, these sovereign will emerge. And so in the case, most notably of the parity bug, then we also have seen some people that were actually involved in the decision-making of like the Ethereum improvement proposal that actually decided to step back from their position by fear of legal liability, because they thought that if they were to take a decision and that decision could then be held against them from the legal system. And so the conclusion is like we cannot really assume that blockchain, like this whole vision of blockchain as an illegal and unregulable system is flawed, and it's even though maybe direct regulation is much more difficult than in a traditional online platform, there is still room for intervention. And then the question, of course, is like what kind of intervention, what kind of actors what kind of pressure can we put on those new actors that are affecting the governance of blockchain technology? So there are discussions about whether the developers or the maintainers should actually hold some kind of fiduciary duties and therefore be responsible for the uses that are made of their software. There is discussion whether, well, maybe we should just criminalize the user and implementing some kind of legal liability for transacting with a particular blockchain network or with a particular application on those networks. But of course, that's very difficult because most of those networks are anyhow pseudonymous and transnational and so forth. There is also those new intermediaries that could also be pressured by government to comply with specific regulatory constraints, perhaps preventing some online cryptocurrency exchanges to actually transact with specific addresses, which have been held to be doing illicit work, or potentially like requiring mining pools to ignore certain transactions that a government doesn't want to have. But the problem then is really that there is no way it is possible to actually exert pressure on any of those actors, and different governments can actually use their power to exert this pressure. The problem is that because of the polycentricity of the system as a whole, it's not enough to regulate one actor. That it's actually necessary to regulate all those actors, and so from a regulatory perspective, like governments, if they really want to have have an influence on the system, they need to understand like the whole complexity and the whole dynamics and power dynamics that exist, but between the technical layers of like miners and validators, but also everything that happens at the more off-chain and social layer of developers or influencer and commercial operators, because they're also the ones that are actually dictating what the selling point will be. So yeah, I think that's about it for the presentation. So yeah, I'm happy. Like basically, the conclusion is just like regulation of blockchain technology requires a very deep understanding and assessment of what is the governance of each one of those blockchain-based networks, and the regulation needs to go via a governance approach as opposed to the traditional top-down regulatory approach that can be done on traditional online platforms.
Thank you, Primavera. Well, I actually do have a question. So you mentioned as examples of, I guess, difficulties in trying to govern a blockchain, the DAO hack, and also the parity bug. Now, that was some time ago, right? And in the meantime, a number of projects made it as one of their, let's say, distinguishing points, some type of maybe more refined self-governance. Do you have any, I don't know, projects or academic studies that you would highlight as going in some interesting direction for baking self-governance into some ledger itself, or you haven't seen anything that seems like sufficiently interesting to you? Or...
I mean, I'm actually, it's my own project, but I'm starting from January, I'm starting a 5 years long European project on this specific question, which is, today there is actually a lot of focus on governance of blockchain technology from a technical layer. So basically, whether it's like, Tezos like on-chain governance, but it is still like using blockchain technology in order to govern blockchain technology. But there is actually very little analysis and like in-depth, I think it's almost like an ethnographic study that is required to actually look at all the actors that are operating and influencing each other outside of the like on the social layer. So I mean, academia is starting slowly to look at the question of off-chain governance, but I think what is lacking is really like an in-depth analysis and ethnographic and research on what is the actual off-chain governance of those communities that is oftentimes not documented, and oftentimes the community themselves are not fully aware of, because it's like a lot of things that happen in the background and in the backstage. So yeah, like I'm actually starting this program, this project to specifically to do that.
So this is some research grant from the European Union on the study of interaction of on-chain and off-chain governance.
Yeah, it's like a European Research Council grant. Okay. And yeah, the idea is to understand better all that is happening at the social layer of blockchain governance, in order to then try and create governance structures for blockchain community that properly integrate the on-chain layer and the off-chain layer together.
Okay, so I agree with that. There's probably a lot that needs to be said in this area, but in terms of, did you sort of had a look at the current landscape of like examples where you would start studying as examples, whether they were good or bad examples empirically in the past few years, or like, I mean, until maybe 3 years ago, maybe Tezos was maybe perhaps the most prominent sort of experiment of self-governance, right? But since then, it's not been the only one. Can argue like how successful it was, but do you have any thoughts about existing projects or ideas out there that?
Yeah, so the idea is like to look at the three main, which is blockchain, Ethereum, and Tezos, as like case studies, and then to identify some pilot projects which are much smaller, and yet are experimenting with actually new governance practices, mostly at the not at necessarily the blockchain level, but at least at the DAO level. So whether it's like DAO Stack, Aragon, and various smaller projects whose objective is to actually design DAOs which have a form of off-chain governance integrated within them, and then experiment on the small project and have this kind of like participatory action research, so that as we analyze and as we theorize about on-chain and off-chain governance, we can also try to model specific, to elaborate specific models and then test them directly on those communities and see how it works. Essentially because we don't have a theory of distributed governance that can be practically instantiated into a blockchain community. And so it's kind of like this lean process of looking at how things work, trying to listen to like what are the pain points and things like that, and then collectively trying to, by integrating academics that have been working on the question of governance in like many different fields, but none that don't necessarily have like in-depth blockchain knowledge, but that have very, very good knowledge in like the more traditional question of governance, and integrating those with the actual blockchain community themselves, and trying to find like how insights from the more traditional academic world can actually help this community evolve in terms of governance, and vice versa is like how can the new tools that are provided by blockchain technology actually inform also or provide new insights that can be fed back into the governance of more traditional institutions. Like how can you incorporate those technology in order to increase, for instance, like the confidence and the trust in other types of institutions.
Yeah, cool, thanks. People have other questions? Yeah. Well, actually, I do have one more question. So this CRC grant, what institutions does it touch, and which researchers, or is it like a large grant with like many people, or is it like a smaller team?
So it's between the CNRS in France and the European University Institute in Florence, and it's like a €2 million grant for 5 years. And so I think it's gonna. I mean, the idea is to create a little team and maybe 3 PhD and 3 to 4 postdoc students that will do this research, and then trying to find as many contributors and collaborators around, and like the goal is really to connect with so to actually hire only people that are non-engineers, that are like social scientists, lawyers, and so forth, within the actual, because that's like the analysis of the social layer, and then connect with as many engineers and computer scientists to actually validate those insights and to collaboratively work out those different, elaborate those models. But the idea is it comes from the observation that there is a lot of research projects that are actually focusing on the technical layer. There is actually not many so far to date, at least on the social layer. And the only way that you can actually understand the social layer is, of course, by also understanding the technical layer. And so the idea is really like, let's create a team of like political scientists and sociologists and lawyers together that analyze the social layer, and then integrate within the work and within the group other disciplines that can also contribute, validate, brainstorm together to further the insights.
Cool. Other questions before we take a break? Chris, do you want to reply today? Okay, so with that in mind, so thank you, Primavera, for the talk. According to the schedule, we're just right on time, which is wonderful. According to this schedule, we'll take a 20-minute break and resume at 1 p.m. California time. Okay, so see you all soon.